Hello everyone, welcome to Enjoy the Book of Life. Today we are going to do a little bit of traveling and we're going to head over to the land of Israel. Now we've done several episodes talking about the land of Israel and connecting geographic locations in our People, Places, Things episodes. But today we're going to do something a little bit different and talk about more like a resource review and talk about actually learning about the land itself, not necessarily learning about a place traced through like we have in our other episodes. So what benefit do you see comes from learning the land, and how does that help us in our own Bible study?
Well, quite obviously, if you're going to the land of Israel, the more you know, the more you enjoy. And if you end up with a bunch of people who want to know some of the most simple things, that's fine. But if you want to dig a little deeper, sometimes it's better to do your research beforehand, because when you're with a group, unfortunately, the group tends to go at the speed of the least interested person. And so if you're constantly frustrated because you want to ask the important questions that are on your mind and there's just no time available. So it's better to do your work beforehand and come prepared so that actually you can share with some others some of the good things you've learned. So I think when we study the land of Israel, it's such a small country, about the size of New Jersey, and yet it's jam-packed, not only with historical information, but for anyone who's interested in archaeology, in architecture, in the flora and fauna. I mean, I have books on the battles of the Bible, on the rivers of the Bible, on the plants of the Bible, and then all the various groups that you read about, the Philistines or the Nabateans and so on. There are just hundreds of subjects that can be studied that really increase your appreciation for Bible lands.
Yeah, so even no matter what your interests are, I remember, C.S. Lewis says, to read what you're really interested in and to write, about what you're interested in, and just seeing the diversity of subjects, find what interests you, and that'll kind of open up that world.
Yeah.
Now, would you recommend going to Israel? Would you recommend that for people?
Well, for many years I didn't, because I saw the slides, the pictures by people who had been there, and as they say, they ran where Jesus walked, and came home with a bunch of disorganized slides, and it was like, here's another picture of a mountain. I think, was that in Samaria, dear? I'm not sure. It just seemed very, very much a waste of time. I thought I'll save my money and I'll go during the millennium when the prices are down. But I was invited to go on a trip. A couple paid for Louise and I to go. It was a good trip in that we were exposed to a lot of good sights. The people that were on the group, it was more herding goats than leading sheep. But I saw the huge benefit of going to the land, and I realized most of the people who were there are retirees. Well, thank the Lord, they've got the time and the money, many of them. But I wanted to get young people there so that they could benefit from it for their whole lives. So when I came back, I arranged a trip for 22 young men, and we went over, and it was real bargain basement. We didn't charge much for the trip, just the bare minimum. And, we just found flat spots to sleep. They were like 3-star Arab hotels, which are just slightly above the Salvation Army. And but we all survived the trip. None of us got food poisoning, and we had a great time. So then I began to encourage more young people to go.
And you said for the benefits that they'd have for their life. What benefits would you say really come from an educated trip to Israel?
Well, I mean, it's the difference between listening to the radio and watching colored TV. Like, you can see, there are a lot of people have this idea of King David as a shepherd boy. He's sitting there with all this Kentucky bluegrass, all the little sheep nibbling while he's sitting under the shade of a tree.
Yeah.
Well, anyone who's been to the wilderness of Judea knows that that is not what it's like. And the dramatic differences in the land. You can see a picture of Galilee and think, oh, that's what Israel's like. But 20 miles south, you're in the terraced olive yards or vineyards of Samaria. And another 30 or 40 miles south, you're in the wilderness of Judea. So there are such dramatic differences in the land. And so I like it when people go that we spend a little time in the high ground, look down and see the relationship between places. Because it's only, as they say, it's only 60 miles wide. So on a clear day, from a high point, you can see the whole width of the land.
Wow.
And so by doing this, you should be able to see Naomi and Ruth leaving Moab and crossing the southern fords of the Jordan and making their way up what's called the Red Ascent, up through the wilderness of Judea and skirting Jerusalem and going down towards Bethlehem. You should be able to see that in your mind. And it's just so much more helpful when we're seeking to describe places, to throw a pebble into Jacob's well and to hear how deep it is,
Right.
or to see the pomegranates growing up at the north, to see that the fruit, the flower, and the bud are all growing at the same time on the tree. To be able to experience the food and the sights and sounds and smells, to stand at the dramatic difference between standing on the shore of Galilee and standing on the shore of the Dead Sea, and to learn sort of spiritual experiences from these. I think it really is invaluable. But obviously, the more you prepare, the more ready you are to leapfrog, to really advance in your understanding.
Like just those illustrations where you're saying Ruth and seeing her, if you get to the place and then you have to be reminded of all the stories. Whereas when you're there and can say, oh yeah, this is where this, and it's a little bit easier. It's like you've already done the structural framework, and then it's just time to hang the paintings.
Right, and we may have talked about this before, but if you're serious about going to the land, you should start a year before you're going. And you should be reading through the sections of the Bible that cover the land of Israel. Now that sounds like, oh, that's the whole Bible. Well, no, it isn't actually. So you're going to start when Abraham arrives in the land, and then when Joseph goes down to Egypt, you stop reading, and then you skip over really the rest of the Pentateuch, and then you're going to read about the conquest in Joshua and the Judges, the little story of Ruth, and probably 1st and 2nd Samuel, maybe touch on the Kings a little bit, but that's not going to be that's just a little overwhelming, really, to get all the Kings in your mind.
Yeah.
But then in the New Testament, to read maybe Matthew or Luke and the first few chapters of Acts. And then you've pretty much covered it. Now, while you're doing that, you should be making notes. And the problem, when I first went, I thought, I know my Bible better than this. I can't make sense of anything here.
Yeah.
It was because we have all of our Bible information arranged chronologically. So Abraham, then Isaac, then Jacob, then Joseph. But when you're there, that's not, it's been refiled on you. And you pull into Hebron and say, what happened at Hebron? Well, Abraham was here. Was Isaac here? Was Jacob? Was Joseph? Like, who was David? Caleb. So we feel like our brains in a blender after a day or two because we haven't refiled our information. So when you pull into Hebron, you should be able to say, yes, this is Abraham's third altar. This is the cave of Machpelah, the plains of Mamre. This was Caleb's inheritance. David reigned here 7.5 years. This is a city of refuge. This is a priestly city. So you have that information. Then you can take the time to make the connections, to see, the what's still there to be seen, and to find your placement. Like where are we in relation to Beersheba, to Jerusalem, and so on.
Right, because even then you've got the stories where they travel from here to there.
Right.
And then again, like you said, having an individual place like Hebron, And then you can start to say, oh, and then there's this connection here.
And even just to realize, like, it's only maybe 60 miles from Nazareth or from Capernaum to Jerusalem, but the Lord Jesus made that journey 3 times every year from the time he was 12 years old. And everything is uphill and down dale. There's virtually nothing flat there.
Yeah.
And so it was a very rigorous thing. It may seem like a small country sitting in a tour bus.
Yeah.
But
right.
if you're walking, especially in 90-degree heat, all of a sudden it gets a pretty challenge. No wonder Jesus was weary sitting by the well.
Right. So what resources, the strategy going through the Bible, and I think that already is a good, if you're reading through the Bible, we're in a new year, and finding a new strategy, I think that's a great suggestion right there, especially if you're planning on going. But what resources would you recommend in preparation to going to Israel? What other resources would you recommend?
Well, we may have talked about Bible atlases and so on. I think we've done that. These would be books that would enhance. They would be the cherry on the top. And so there are a few books I would recommend. This is by Charles Feinberg. Now, Feinberg was a professor of Old Testament.
Yes, and we've had an episode on him as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, and this is him going through Israel section by section in the Bible, right? And so he has Israel in the law, and Israel in the poetry books and so on, the prophets, and Israel in the New Testament, the book of Acts. And he just makes so many good connections. So I was looking at this little section here. This is just a paragraph. The book of Nehemiah, the account of the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem according to the will and purpose of God, lists the enemies of the work of God among his people, chapter 4, 7 to 8. Among the antagonists of God's work were the Arabians, sons of Ishmael. Okay, so he's talking about the conflict between Isaac and Ishmael. And then he says, centuries later, one of the most solemn scenes in all human history was transacted. The blessed Son of God, the incarnate second person of the Trinity, was on trial for his life before none other than Herod. And who was his ancestor? Herod the Great, as to parentage? Mark this. His mother was a Nabatean of Ishmael, and his father was an Idumean of Esau. The son of Isaac was being judged by the son of Ishmael. Now, to get a hold of a little nugget like that, and to follow through on this, and to see this conflict that we see in the news all the time, and to follow it through, and then to see time and again these showdowns, right?
Yeah.
So, again, making these connections, I think, are hugely helpful. And Feinberg is just excellent at doing that. A second book for a very different reason. This is called Jerusalem, the Tragedy and the Triumph by Charles Gulston. I don't know if it's still in print. I'm sure you can get used copies. But if ever you wanted to read good writing, this is it. Listen to this writing. He's talking about Jerusalem, of course. It has been said that if blood was indelible, old Jerusalem would be red, all red. The words, weighted against the stark facts of history, appall in their degree of accuracy. But of course the city is not red. The sun and the rain have erased the scarlet stains. It is tawny-colored, the color of a lion's skin, as H.V. Morton describes it. It is different from the new city only because the centuries have weathered the local sandstone more, particularly portions of the ancient walls. And there is perhaps no other experience quite like seeing these for the first time. So it's just so well written. And what he does is he takes you around the city of Jerusalem and he describes the place where Abraham offered Isaac and where David's men took the city and so on. and he goes in and there are photos. He takes pictures and he describes as it is now, but the historical background to the story, and it's just written in such a beautiful way.
When was it written?
It's not that old a book.
Okay.
I think it was fairly new when I was a young buck, but let's see here. This was written in 78.
Okay.
So,
okay.
yeah.
And I remember when we went, you had the scope of the land. You're trying to figure the whole north to south, east to west, and follow the valleys and kind of get that all in your mind. And again, you should have that, a good bit of that. But then what was surprising to me is when we went to Jerusalem,
Oh, right.
it was like that all over again. In a single city,
right,
and I wasn't ready for that. I think I tried to prepare and get a good framework to where I kind of knew where we were and where we were in relationship to a lot of things.
Right.
But when I got to Jerusalem, I was overwhelmed. So I think that would be something I would recommend, is to spend extra time on the city.
Right.
And so that sounds like
Yeah,
a great
you've
resource.
got Melchizedek, and you can go to the little street which is just south of the Dung Gate, Melchizedek Street, which is in the King's Dale where Abraham met Melchizedek.
Oh, wow.
You can go up onto the Temple Mount. You can go into the mosque or the shrine of the Dome of the Rock, and you can look at the spot where they say Abraham offered his son. Now, I'm not sure that's the place, but you can see where the temple was in those days, right? You can think about Isaiah and King Hezekiah and the battle with Sennacherib. You can see the tunnel that Hezekiah had cut through down to the lower pool and so on. And you think of all the things that happened there, right through to the early church, where the church sat on the temple steps there and where they had some of their early meetings, and of course the Lord Jesus and his many visits to Jerusalem. So it is quite overwhelming.
Yeah.
And a book like this by Gulston, he takes you by the hand, chapter by chapter, to different high spots, important places, and describes them to you. Yeah. I found very helpful.
Good.
Also, in light of that, now this is a very different book. It's called O Jerusalem. It's a secular book by Collins and LaPierre. It's a bit slow getting started, so it's not for the faint-hearted. It's quite a thick book, but it goes back and it tells the story of the establishment of the state of Israel. By the time you get to the last chapter or two, you're saying, please don't stop, keep going, right? But it's just such a fascinating book to read, and it helps you set the framework for modern history and what brought about the establishment of the state of Israel. Good.
You've got a few more here?
Yes, another book, another secular book, which I would encourage for the people who like a thrill, is a book called The Mossad. Now, Mossad was the secret organization. Originally, it was designed to try and get Jews out of Europe, away from the Holocaust, and get them to Palestine. But it eventually became like their secret police. But there are a whole series of short stories in that book on the Mossad, the way they got the plans for the what is their Kafir, their fighter jet from the French, and how they got the gunboats of Cherbourg, and the story of Eli Cohen, their man in Damascus. Fascinating stories. Yeah. So as far as spy stories, some of you may have read the novels by Bodhi Taney, and she uses a lot of those stories. She's woven them into her books, but these are the actual accounts of those stories. Another beautifully written book is by J.W. Clapham. Again, this is an older book, Palestine, Land of My Adoption. Clapham was a school teacher. I think we talked about him before. An English, or I think Australian or New Zealand school teacher. During his summer holiday was traveling to Britain, but the British had just taken the land of Israel away from the Turks, and so he landed there, And while he was sitting up on Mount Carmel looking down on Haifa Bay, he realized the place where the church began, he didn't know of one New Testament church in the whole land. And so he cabled home and said he was staying and started doing gospel work, just basically living in a tent.
Wow.
And moving from place to place. And in those 5 years saw an assembly started in Haifa and Jaffa and Jerusalem, and then went home and got married and came back and saw the start of the assembly in Nicosia, Cyprus, and in Istanbul, Turkey, and in Damascus, Syria, and in Beirut, Lebanon, and several in Egypt.
Wow.
So anyway, he wrote this book about his travels in Israel.
Oh, wow.
And they're just so fascinating. He tells these amazing stories, talks about things that I don't think we could do today, like climbing Mount Gerizim.
Oh, wow.
And the people that he met along the way. But it's full of wonderful little stories where he made contact with people in the land, and some of the great illustrations of the gospel. So this is a real classic. I treasure this book. And then finally, this book, Holy Fields by Howard Kitchen, an introduction to the historical geography of the Holy Land. Now, he gives a lot more detail as to the stones, the rock structure, and so on, in his study of the land. But I just read a paragraph or so here. We have already given Conder's vivid picture of the wilderness of Judah, which stretched along the whole western margin of the Dead Sea. Now, he then goes on to describe Sir George Smith's description of the Dead Sea. And this is how it goes. The glare of Sodom and Gomorrah is flung down the whole length of Scripture history. In this awful hollow, this bit of the infernal regions come to the surface, this hell with the sun shining into it. Primitive man laid the scene of God's most terrible judgment on sin. We feel the flames scorch our own cheeks. Though the glare of this catastrophe burns still, the ruins of it have entirely disappeared, and there remains in the valley no authentic trace of the names it has torn and scattered to infamy across the world. If you like that kind of writing, this book is just full of these amazing descriptions. And he interacted with a lot of the archaeologists in the heyday of British archaeology in the Middle East. And so I think you would find this a tremendous book, Holy Fields. And again, these books you'll have to get reprints, books off of ABE books or something like that. But,
Now, with Clapham's book, you talked about him climbing Mount Gerizim. You say, I probably couldn't do that today. There are several things that maybe even when you went your first time that you couldn't do today. Is that
exactly
true?
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Sort of the tides of history move in that area, and there are certain times when things open up and then they close. And if you're there at the right time, you get to see it. Now, thankfully, many of the sites that you want to see are somewhat duplicated. So, for example, if you went to Hatzor, this is a fortified city that was one of Solomon's chariot cities to control the northern approaches from Syria. And you'll see the water system that's used there and the triple Solomonic gates and so on. If you couldn't get there and you could get to Megiddo, you'd see almost an identical water system, and you'll see the same triple gates and so on. So very often, if you miss one spot, it would be nice to go everywhere, but you can't always do it. Hebron used to be open, and it was an interesting place to visit. and you had this building over the cave of Machpelah where the patriarchs were buried, and one end was for the Jews and the other end was for the Muslims, and it was actually a building that was constructed in the days of Herod.
Huh.
But then an off-duty soldier went in and shot up the place and made it extreme. There's the Jews that live in Hebron live in an armed camp. They can only go to the market if they have military vehicles taking them to the market and bringing them back to their little enclosed fortification in the city of Hebron. So, yeah, it's not wise to try and go there. The same is true with the road that leads from Shechem up into the Jezreel Valley straight north. That used to be a great ride because you could stop and you could see some things that are biblically significant. But nowadays, if we go at all, we come in off the Jordan Valley, we come up to Shechem or Shiloh, Shechem rather, and Sychar, and then we head back out to the Jordan Valley. Because the valley of Shechem between Ebal and Gerizim is the perfect ambush site. And very often if you go there, you'll see Israeli soldiers up on the tops of the buildings with their Uzi submachine guns, and they're going to keep you safe, but it's at a price, you know.
Yeah.
So there are places you just can't get to. Now, speaking of that, there are some people think, well, you know, a lot of the festivals are in the fall. Wouldn't it be great if we went during the festivals? But you know what they've done to the festivals. You know what we've done to Christmas and Easter and Thanksgiving, right? And so, for example, they celebrate Purim. It's like their Halloween. The kids get dressed up and they do little skits and things. And what you find out is that you learn very little about the actual biblical accounts, and it holds you up in your tour. They block off streets, they close down places, and so sometimes it's not as good. So as far as I'm concerned, very often people can only go in the summer. It's very hot in the summer, but that's when the crowds are there and the prices are up. But if you can go in the spring, it's a little cheaper, and you might get the odd rain, but usually the air is clearer.
You can see farther.
The spring flowers are out, and not as big crowds. So
and so you say
better.
The spring. What is the
March, April?
March, April. Okay.
Yeah, into May.
Okay.
Yeah.
Any other practical tips and tricks? I think one is, like you said, choosing the right group, and doing your homework beforehand, going the right time, as much as you can control that. Are there other little tips and tricks you'd have?
Well, clearly, when you're taking photos, take a lesson from somebody who knows how to do photographs, first of all.
Okay.
And then secondly, when you take photos, even if it's every third or fourth shot, write it down in a notebook as to what that photo is.
Yeah.
Because otherwise you get home and you have no idea. That's a valley, I think. I don't know where it was.
And you could probably, if you're doing I'm assuming digital photography.
Yes.
Being able, if you had your computer, even matching your itinerary with the dates you take the dates and times you took the photos. So you would have that information, but if you had a detailed itinerary, that would help with the photographs.
Another thing that I think is helpful, when you're taking pictures, for example, you're going to have a lot of panoramas, like at Jezreel. You're going to have a shot going up towards Haifa and the Kishon River Valley. You're going to be looking across to Nazareth. You're going to have a shot at Mount Tabor and the Hill of Moreh, and then to Mount Gilboa, and then to Megiddo. And so what you need to do is to realize where that picture is related to this picture, and tell your observers, the people who are watching this, say, all right, now we're going to move a little bit to the east, and tell people we're looking straight north here, or we're looking northeast, and help them get the panorama too, because they're not standing there. They can't stitch it together in their mind.
Right.
And it's very good if we can ask the guide those questions. For example, if you go and visit Emmaus, and then you get on the bus and you drive for 40 minutes and you get out at Gibeon. Well, the fact is you're on two sides of the same ridge. You've been driving 40 minutes, all these windy roads all the way around, but you could almost throw a stone from one to the other.
Yeah.
And so it's important when you are sort of getting the layout in your mind. And what I did was I just traced little subsections of the land. So the coast road, the Jezreel Valley, the Galilee, north of the Galilee, the Jordan Valley, the environs of Jerusalem, the eastern, the Shephelah, the foothills, and down at the Dead Sea. And so I had those little maps ready, so then I could look on those, and they give you maps usually when you're there, and sometimes if you draw on it and say this is where we traveled, it will help you when you get home to realize, yeah, this is the route we took.
And part of that is not zoning in out when you're on the bus.
Right.
Because again, you're there and it's mentally active. You're in, and then you get on the bus and it's,
Yeah.
and then you're just driving. But you're not just driving. You're in that connection point from A to B, and so keeping your mind about you as you do that.
People drive by a lot of things that they wish they had seen if only someone had pointed it out to them. Mm-hmm. And so sometimes you have to say to the guide, look, we're heading down the Jordan Valley. Everybody just falls asleep driving down. They're so exhausted they just fall asleep. So no, when we're driving down the Jordan Valley, will you show me the cut in the eastern plateau where the fords of Jabbok are, right? Where Abraham wrestled with the angel of the Lord.
Yeah.
And further up that river is Mahanaim, where David had his court in exile, right? Will you show me the sign that says to Adam Bridge?
Right.
When the water backed up as far as Adam. Those are things you can see driving down the Jordan Valley.
Yeah.
And 99 out of 100 people that go never see those things.
Yeah.
And they're right there for anyone to see them. So sometimes we have to sort of anticipate what we're going to see and then ask if we can see it. And there are some things, for example, like walking the ramparts in Jerusalem and having a map of Jerusalem. So when you're up there, you say, oh yeah, this is the Armenian quarter. This is where this synagogue was, or this is the Gehinnom Valley. And so you sort of keep track of where you are all the time, because otherwise there's so much you lose in the process.
And that, I think, comes back to the preparation, like it's saying, anticipating what might you see.
Yeah.
Saying, okay, what's our itinerary for tomorrow? And that night before you go to bed, putting together that little checklist, and then having that map ready when you're going to Jerusalem, right? Because that map's going to be different than the map you were using the day before going through the Judean wilderness. So having those available.
Now, one last thing, when you're there in Jerusalem, one of the most important things that you do while you're there is to go to the YMCA and have a Sunday. They have very good Sundays. No, but when you're there, it's the most beautiful YMCA in the world. And when you go in, you'll see that the decorations inside are taken from the temple that was built in the days of Solomon. Beautiful work. And sometimes, if you've got a good someone working there, sometimes give them a few bakshish, they'll let you climb up the tower overlooking the city of Jerusalem. It was the only view that the Jews had into the city of Jerusalem from 1948 to 67.
Wow. Yeah, really helpful, I think, resource from, you've been to Israel a good many times since that first trip, when you I wouldn't say reluctantly, but you went because someone funded it, and then you saw this as such a big asset. So it's helpful getting those tips, and again, going through the scriptures, reading it for yourself, finding those, reorganizing the filing cabinet, so to speak, especially with a trip coming up, and some helpful resources as well.
Yeah, so the way your notes would look is Abraham comes, crosses into the land, and pitches a tent and builds an altar. And so you're going to put Abraham's first altar and put the reference there. And then as you go on, it's good to have a Bible dictionary that you don't duplicate places. So Beth Aven and Bethel are the same place. Or Galilee, Kinneret, Tiberias, all the same place. So you want to make sure that you have them all listed there. And then as you go on, Abraham moves somewhere else, and then you write down the second thing, and you keep adding sheets. And then before you go on your trip, you can rearrange those pages according to your day. So day 1 is the coast road. You can put the items in there from Joppa up to Haifa or whatever.
And that would be again, a lot easier if you got it all digitally. You'll find some good maps, print those out, you're set to go. That would be great.
Yeah.
Good. Well, thank you.
Yes, sir.